You are listening to the Novel Writing Podcast, episode 202. I'm your host, Colleen Mitchell. Grab a cup, cozy up, and let's get to writing. Today we're going to dig into developmental editing. It's arguably the most important of all the major professional edits that books go through. Sometimes you can get away with doing your own developmental editing via vicious critique partners, but we will talk more about that later in the episode. I have been through 8 developmental edits across my 3 published books and my 1 unpublished but soon-to-be published book. 3 for book 1, 1 for book 2, 3 for book 3, and 1 for book 4. Kind of interesting how that turned out. So what do developmental editors do? From a high level, dev editors do large-scale, structural, and plot-based edits that focus on making the story's bones strong enough to support the story. This includes, among other things, paying attention to plot and plot holes, pacing, theme, flow, character motivations and arcs, and how well the characters develop from start to finish. It's big picture editing that often forces authors to make drastic changes to their manuscripts in service to making the story the best it can possibly be. Dev editors should be providing suggestions on deepening conflict, stakes, and tension, recommending cuts, expansions, or the reordering of scenes and or chapters, and helping you keep your cast as small as possible and still be able to tell the story. My first book, Mark of Stars, went through 3 rounds of developmental edits. Through those edits, Haley and I blew up the middle twice, nuked a few characters, combined others, and I cut the total word count from 105,000 words down to about 58,000. Those edits helped me cut 45% of words I didn't need. I've talked before about how reducing your word count increases your profits as an indie author. Essentially, the more words in your manuscript, the higher the print cost, which lowers your royalty for print versions. Not all books need to be 100,000 plus, but unfortunately, that seems to be common among first-time fantasy authors putting their fingers to the keyboard. However, if the most streamlined version of your story requires 100,000 or more words, then do that. But don't strive for 100,000 for no other reason than you see authors on social media writing that much. I guarantee, on first drafts especially, the vast majority of those words are probably not necessary. And that's what dev editors help us with. They will see the info dumps and the meandering middles and the subplots taking over the main plot before we will, and most importantly, help us fix them. If your developmental editor is pointing out issues but not offering a solution or a way to fix it, then I would advise that you find a different editor. What do dev editors not do? Developmental editors should not be marking up your story or even leaving tons and tons of comments. While it can certainly be a dopamine hit to see a bunch of comments on your manuscript, the comments should be substantially about issues with the story, not things the editor thought were funny. Ideally, you should not have any red marks or track changes in a returned manuscript. Only comments and a summary of suggested changes, whether at the bottom or in a separate editorial letter. And I can't believe I have to say this, but those comments cannot consist of nothing but emojis. And yes, I have an author friend who paid a lot of money only to receive an entire developmental edit with nothing but emoji comments. This is why Haley and I always recommend working with an editor who comes recommended by a trusted author friend or an author you trust. Do not look for your editor on mass professional marketplaces like Reedsy or Fiverr. You will probably be disappointed. Okay, tangent over. We're paying developmental editors to tell us what needs fixing, not to tell us that we're good writers already, although that's sometimes nice to hear. That being said, they aren't going to be fixing grammar, spelling, punctuation, word choices, or suggesting ways to streamline your paragraphs unless the way you're saying something impacts the plot's direction. Dev editors should not be telling you to change the essence or genre of your story or rewrite it how they think it should go. Remember, your intent as the author always trumps an editor's suggestions. So if a dev editor tells you that something has to be a certain way, run. Dev editors are also not supposed to judge your writing. They should be helping you improve your craft, not making snide remarks about how much you don't know. And finally, they are not ghostwriters or co-authors. While I credit many of my series ideas to Haley because of the work that we've done together throughout those 8 dev edits, she did not help me write the story. I'm the originator and the author, and she is the professional I hired to help me bring that vision to life. You don't have to take any editor suggestions, but the point of a developmental edit is to get out of your tunnel vision with the book to see how it can be improved. And that often means hearing things like, this character is unnecessary, you should get rid of him or combine him with another character. Or, you need more things to keep the story moving, here are ideas for obstacles, stakes, or tension that could help. Or, this middle is too saggy, here's why. Let's discuss ways we can fix it. That's right, many dev editors will meet with you to review the edits, and this is key. Brainstorm with you on ways to fix things. So, the big question, do you need a dev editor? My answer is, in many cases, yeah, you do. Skipping the developmental edit, especially on long books with complex plots, puts authors at risk of an underdeveloped and saggy story. If you've been following the podcast since the beginning, you know that Haley spent 12 years writing and editing her first book before she published it, but part of the reason it kept getting rejected by agents early on was that it wasn't developmentally edited. This is common. As authors, we often cannot see the holes or the weak points in our stories on our own, but know that over time we become better at identifying those things, which reduces how many rounds our books might need to go through for dev edits. However, there are a few situations where I think authors can get away with not spending the money on a dev editor. Number 1, you're writing novellas. Novellas tend to have few, if any, subplots, so it's a lot easier to stay on track with the storyline, to fix plot holes and keep things moving. It's unlikely that you'd need to developmentally edit a novella unless you don't have a good grasp of story structure, or you're planning a long episodic story with arcs that transcend one single novella and should be looked at cohesively rather than just one at a time. This would be like writing a TV show with novellas, where each season of your TV show is a complete arc of the story, and each episode is a novella in that season, if that makes sense. So if you plan to write novellas and forego developmental editing, I'd recommend checking out the craft book, My Story Can Beat Up Your Story, which is aimed at screenwriters but breaks down what makes a good story work. I used that craft book to write my prequel novella by scaling the 44 plot points that he talks about down by half. Number 2, you have a circle of vicious critique partners or dedicated readers who are not afraid of giving honest feedback, and they can do so on a timeline that fits your schedule. If you can't afford a developmental editor, but you have a really good community of fellow authors and or readers who want to give you honest critical feedback, that can act as a substitute for a developmental edit. However, you have to take into account that it will probably take longer. It might need to go through more rounds than if you paid a professional, and the final product still might not be what it could have been with a paid professional developmental editor. That being said, no matter what method you use, you must be open to receiving feedback, especially feedback that may be difficult to hear. Again, you don't have to take every suggestion, but you have to be open to changes. I have resisted practically everything Haley suggests until I sit with it for a while. That might just be a me thing, but that's how my brain works. And that also doesn't mean I implement every suggested change, but I'm open to hearing how the story could improve, even if I'm in love with how it's currently written and I have kind of a bad expression on my face when I'm talking to her on our Zoom calls. But I promise, if I sit with those suggestions for a while, I usually end up not hating most of them. Number 3, you're writing serialized fiction and you take live feedback from readers. Not everyone is doing this, but it's how authors like Seth Ring got started in their fiction writing journeys. If you've ever written on platforms like Wattpad or Ream or Kindle Vella before it got discontinued, or even if you're familiar with writing fan fiction, serialized fiction posted one chapter at a time with live reader comments or feedback is what shapes or edits the story in real time. Stories like these generally don't need developmental edits before moving from the free platform to releasing on platforms like Amazon, because all the story development happened with the readers it was intended for. And in cases like that, it's possible for a developmental editor's suggestions to directly contradict things that the first readers actually enjoyed. For a particularly spicy take on the necessity of developmental editors, check out the link in the description to Seth Ring's video on this topic. And lastly, number 4, you might not need a developmental editor if you're willing to release potentially bloated or underdeveloped stories because you trust that the right readers will find them and that the sales from your early audience can fund future dev edits. This is what many indie authors do. Early books are not as good, not as polished, and show how green they were when they first started out. But to be honest, that's like everybody. It's also the case with trad books because no matter how you publish, writing is a skill that we develop with each subsequent book. However, this method runs the risk of your first book or series being a total flop because it never drew readers in and thus never created the fan base it could have built. I have read first-in-series books by indies who were all prepped to sell a bunch of books at events, and even with the entire series all ready to go, only for the first book to contain so many errors, or plot holes, or inconsistencies that made it clear that they didn't use an editor that I ended up never reading the next book in the series. Losing reader interest in book 1 is a death knell for author success, but again, the more you write and learn craft and the more you're open to feedback and critique, whether from writing partners or editors, the better your future books will be. Just don't be surprised if that first book isn't a smash hit. Most aren't. Overall, I believe developmental editors are important, especially for new authors. I know there are people who disagree with me on that, but remember, we are all entitled to our opinions, and there are plenty of indie authors who have published without going through any dev edits. The question is simply, do you want to do your story justice? Or do you want to meet an arbitrary deadline? Because it's kind of hard to do both. That is it for today's episode. Thanks for joining me, and remember, first draft is supposed to be garbage. The Novel Writing Podcast is a production of Colleen Mitchell Writes. For more writing resources, including Curios, Tally Inc. author services, and the 60-day novel writing challenge, check out the links in the description.